First of all, we have on my immediate left is Martin Stewart Weeks, who is a principal of an organisation called Public Purpose. But more importantly for this session, he was a panel member of the New South Wales Regulatory Policy Framework Review that was recently completed. Then the next speaker will be Kip Viscusi, and I assume I shouldn't need to introduce Kip, but kind of like the comedian last night, I'll just do a quick recap, which is basically that Kip is, among other things, an international expert on regulation and having written a textbook on the economics of regulation, and also a variety of roles around cost-benefit analyses. Then we'll be followed by Sue McCluskey, who's sitting next to Martin. Sue was also a formal panel member on the New South Wales Regulatory Policy Framework Review. Her other roles have also included, she was a member of the Harper Review of Competition Policy. She was an executive director of the Office of Best Practice Regulation, and other roles as she was the ex-CEO of the Regional Australia Institute. Finally, in the middle is Peter Abelson. Peter takes on a number of roles, incredible number of roles in fact. He is a politician, he's the Mayor of Mosman. He's a public servant, he does work for Treasury. He's a consultant, and he's a prior academic and a long-term, most importantly for us, a long-term friend of the Economic Society, and is often sort of participating in Economic Society events of particular relevance to this panel. He has done an awful lot of work on cost-benefit analysis of investments and regulation in New South Wales and other locations. So, with that, I'm going to get things kicked off with Martin Stewart Weeks, and perhaps Martin, could you give a brief background to this New South Wales Regulatory Policy Framework Review, and I believe your special interest is around technology issues.
It is. Good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I think we all work for New South Wales Treasury these days, so anyway, I just thought I'd say that as a citizen of New South Wales. Let me talk a little bit about the review, which where it was set up and why it's arrived. In fact, we have a meeting tomorrow afternoon to get very close, we hope, to finalising our report, which will be launched very shortly thereafter. Some of you may be aware that last year the New South Wales Auditor-General issued a reasonably critical report, I think is a reasonably friendly and polite way of describing the report, about the New South Wales Government's attempts to prosecute a red tape reduction program. And if I paraphrase it, largely not a good effort, I think, was kind of what the Auditor-General was suggesting. And even the effort that you've made, I'm again perhaps being a little harsh, even the efforts that you've made, we're not entirely sure that they're terribly credible or realistic. So would you like to have another think about that? I think she was suggesting politely. The Minister, Victor Dominello, decided that this was a terrific opportunity to do a couple of things. One is to get a few people independently, and we're led by someone who's reasonably well known in this state, Nick Greiner, a former Premier and somebody who has some quite staunch views about regulation, regulatory policy and their costs, benefits and otherwise, and then Sue and myself. And Victor Dominello basically asked us to do a couple of things. One is to, I guess, absorb a little bit of the pressure from the Auditor-General, which is fine, that's what you do. You set up an independent panel and they can take a little bit of the heat for you, at least initially. But rather more seriously, to step back a bit and say, could you think a little bit, he suggested to us, could you think a little bit, not so much specifically about the issues of reducing red tape, which is obviously something that, like all good politicians, he and others are constantly worried about, but actually could you think a little bit about some of the more fundamental issues about regulatory policy in the first place? And maybe provide us being the New South Wales Government, not so much with a way about how we might do red tape reduction programs better in the future, although we have got some things to say about that, but actually to give us some advice about how we ought to be thinking about regulation as a profoundly important function of good government in the first place, and indeed good policy making. So this was an invitation that I think none of us needed too much prompting to take up. So in the appropriate way, we said, yes, Minister, we will do that. And I hope he's going to be happy with what we've come up with. And we can perhaps talk a little bit more about the detail of that later on. I'm going to just do some very, very brief scene setting and then talk a bit about The issue that particularly interested me, and one of the reasons I'm on the panel, given that I wouldn't claim at all to have deep regulatory or economics credentials, although I have been involved in both over a 35-year public service career in one form or another, consulting and so on in Canberra and Sydney, New South Wales. But I've got a particular focus on the impact of data and digital on the business of regulation. And the reason that the Minister asked me to join this panel is that I chair for him and one of his departments, the Digital Government Transformation Panel, which is a panel of outsiders, basically, that meets every few months to give some thoughts and ideas to the government about how they can dramatically improve the rate and intensity at which they're using those issues, data, digital, and to some extent design, to use our other D word of the day, to do something interesting about the way government works. So I said, yes, I'll take that job on very happily. So a couple of observations I'll make more generally about the review, and Sue will take up some of these issues in a bit more detail in her remarks. So the first thing to say is that we took the characterisation that the game that we're trying to play here is an attempt to pull together a kind of triangle of issues. So on the one hand, there are traditional and very important issues around safety, consumer safety, community safety, when you think about regulation as a function. The second issue is very much about productivity and the impact of regulation on the way in which we conduct our economy, and indeed to some extent, if you like, conduct our society and our communities. And the third corner of our triangle, very much driven by the Minister who particularly gave us this brief, is innovation. So from Victor Dominello's point of view and from the government's point of view, increasingly the conversation about regulation is a conversation about how you balance that triangle. Productivity in the broadest sense, safety and community safety and individual safety, and reassurance and innovation. So we took that frame and we basically went right back and asked ourselves, and indeed many of those that we then conversed with, and we've talked to a lot of people in the last few months, both inside government, regulators, policymakers, and of course as many as we can anyway with people outside government. The regulated, which in some respects is pretty much every single one of us, but particularly certain industries and certain sectors who have a specific focus on being regulated. And we asked them essentially really some quite profound questions about the nature and experience of the regulatory function in New South Wales. What's it like, as it were, to be regulated? What does it mean? What, in a day-to-day sense, does it actually mean for your businesses and for you as individuals? And we talked very significantly with folks around that. With some of the submissions that we've had, and they're all available, I think have really tried to tease that out. And really it reminded us very deeply, I think, that regulation clearly is a form of very important government intervention. It's a decision by governments to get involved in something. And the question in our minds increasingly, and we've tried to tease this out in a report which I hope will be both readable, accessible, and begin to open these questions out, is when government does decide to intervene, the question is to go right back and answer some profoundly basic questions like why? What is it exactly you're trying to achieve? What are you going to do through the regulation and how are you going to execute it? And one might also put, there's a sort of parentheses, and by the way, after you've done it, you might care to go back and see whether anything about those questions that you answered at the beginning bear any resemblance to what actually happened. Would you like to kind of close that loop? In that sense, of course, we started to see the conversation not really about regulation per se, but about profoundly fundamental and very important questions about policy review in the first place. In other words, let's position regulation where it should be, which is as a very, very foundational function of government and its policy-making role. So that was one frame that we took. We've taken a frame which I'm not going to talk about. We've a second slice of this that we talked about, and we've talked about a lot in the report that Sue will talk a lot more about, is characterising the nature of the task in government around regulation as one of stewardship and one of actually cultivating and curating a very, very important public policy asset. I won't say more about that at the moment. Sue can pick that up later in our remarks and we can talk about that as we go. I would also suggest that we talked, the third angle that I will kind of quickly put on this before I make a couple of observations about the technology piece in particular, is the relationship between this conversation and one that I've certainly accessed in many other respects, based on the work of Peter Drucker, the management writer, who has spoken very powerfully in his earlier writings about the notion, this is in the context of organisational change, about the context of what he called the theory of the business. This is a notion that any business, any organisation, indeed any big system, has the job of trying to marry up a sense of its mission, a sense of the context within it. In other words, what is it trying to achieve? The context within which it works, and the capabilities that are available in order to achieve those things. Another nice, helpful triangle. And to some extent, I think our report has offered offer the New South Wales government, and indeed the broader community, some observations about what one might call the changing theory of the business of regulation and where it fits. And we've tried to provide some observations about where in New South Wales the balance should lie in terms of where and how you put regulation to work. The particular focus that I've been interested in, and I have a couple of very quick examples just from some of my recent both reading and research, is what is happening to the, if you like, the art and practice of regulation as a function of our shift towards an increasingly and irretrievably digital and data-infused world. What is that doing? Is it allowing us to do the bits of regulation that we do now better and faster and smarter, so we can talk to people differently? We can now get, instead of getting a few hundred submissions, we can get hundreds of thousands of comments on websites and all the rest of it. So is that all it's doing, essentially accelerating, augmenting and amplifying the existing business of how we go about regulating? Or is it in fact in some cases giving us a completely new way to regulate in the first place? Or even more interestingly, is the wonderful world of big data and analytics and the digital world in which we live beginning to create opportunities for us to not regulate in the first place? To suggest that there might be other ways of getting to the policy outcome we want to achieve. Funnily enough, and I don't know whether people share this view, but my own sense is that what is happening, and I read some stuff about it particularly again this morning in one of my various feeds that came in that I'm sure others are aware of, and that is the move in Australia to move towards an increasingly seamless and digital immigration and travel experience in Australia. So we're doing away, well, we've already started doing away with having to queue up at particular parts of the airport and get yourself stamped, because you can do a lot of that automatically now. We're now getting to the realm where outgoing and incoming passenger cards are going to disappear. And the reason they're going to disappear is and it seems to me, it's not unreasonable to characterise those as a form of regulation, certainly an intervention by government. The reason they're going to disappear is because increasingly those functions, those gateway functions, are going to be done as a result of being able to draw data from other sources and other places about that particular person, that particular traveller, and to enable that process to be done increasingly, as it were, on the move and on the fly, rather than having to write out little bits of cardboard, which you then have to hand to somebody who then presumably stamps them and puts them in a great big pile, so somebody else has to read them and put them into a machine, and so on and so forth. So it strikes me that there is a very interesting capability that's emerging in terms of the way we use data and in terms of the way we engage the digital world, which is allowing us to have some conversations about how we do the regulation that we need to do now more effectively, but whether in fact there are ways of preempting more expensive and more complicated regulatory interventions, because there may be other ways of regulating people's behaviour, because mostly, clearly, regulation is an attempt to shift people's behaviour in directions that we assume are better than the ones that they're currently doing, or the way they're currently behaving. There are a lot of other interesting examples, a couple that I've been recently reflecting on, both from the US. There's an interesting story about the extent to which the New York Fire Department is increasingly using data from building regulation, planning and assessment, and environmental regulation to work out where the hotspots are for buildings that are in danger of going up in flames. And it's becoming a very powerful way to direct the scarce resources of existing regulators. In other words, let's go and check the buildings that we think are most at risk. And it's also beginning to show how, if you get slightly ahead of the game, you can go into places where you can start preempting building quality in such a way that you can try and avoid the fires happening in the first place. Another interesting example, it also comes from New York, is the use of the social media site Yelp to start finding hotspots where restaurants are basically in violation of health and hygiene regulations and making people sick. It turns out that Yelp is not a bad way, reasonably crude but quite sort of effective, to find out where the hotspots are. In other words, I mean, literally you can find out that all of a sudden there are a relatively small cluster of restaurants about which there are increasingly vociferous complaints from what I think one Deloitte review I saw recently referred to as citizen regulators. Sounds a slightly scary concept to me, but I think we all understand if we're in a restaurant, we have a mobile phone, by definition we are de facto regulators, and if we decide to take the effort to tell the world that we thought that particular meal we had was terrible, and we saw a couple of bugs in the lettuce or whatever we saw, if you start aggregating that kind of data, it turns out regulators can find that quite valuable in terms of, again, searching for hotspots and searching for places that we can start concentrating scarce resources. So through the report, and we've taken a very specific focus on this, we've challenged current regulators, we've challenged agencies, we've challenged those who are being regulated to think very carefully about ways in which the world of data plus digital, and as I say, partly if we take some of the design concepts about using customers and citizens as your collaborators in this, are there ways in which we can dramatically rethink at least some aspects of the way we currently regulate? And, as I say, more interestingly, are there opportunities where we can get ahead of the game to some extent in such a way that it begins to change the nature of the regulatory and policy focus in the first place? So let me leave it at that. That's just a very quick framing of a piece of work that is about to hit the streets. Sue will take some of the issues a little bit further, and we can obviously open some further observations up in questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. We'll leave, perhaps if we can leave questions till the end. So I think we'll now move on to Kip. I think you've got some slides. I'll let you press it rather than me mess things up. Thank you. Wonderful.
And in advance, I hit what? Oh, that works. Yeah, it works. Yeah, I'm going to talk today about what are we supposed to do with all the behavioral economics results in the context of regulatory analysis. And I'm sympathetic to behavioral economics issues. I'm the founding editor of the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty and still edit the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, where a lot of this work has appeared. But the question is, what should we do with it in the policy context? And we're going to end up, in this paper that I wrote with Ted Gayer, we propose that there should be a behavioral transfer test. So we should apply the same kind of rigor with respect to the behavioral findings that we do in other contexts for benefit cost analysis. So anyway, there's emerged in the literature an enormous number of behavioral failures. I'm sort of surprised that I can still function, given the range of failures that have been identified. But anyway, people make mistakes all the time, whether it's involving risk, whether it involves time, or so on. And these behavioral failures are increasingly being used to justify regulatory interventions. And we're going to provide some examples from the United States of how substantial a role behavioral failures now play. My main message is a fairly cautious one, which is even if there's a behavioral failure of some sort, a behavioral inadequacy, that doesn't give us carte blanche to override consumer choices and override what's going on in the market. And what we prefer is a behavioral transfer test. And we still like using the full information, rational decision-making reference point as the standard for judging things. Well, the categories of market failure, the first is the benefit cost test. If you want to maximize the net benefits associated with the regulation. Alternatively, do we want to recognize this would be consumer sovereignty, but if consumers are irrational, do we still recognize consumer sovereignty? So if they're making rational decisions in a fully informed market, we believe consumer sovereignty should triumph. But if they're behaving irrationally, should we still respect consumer preferences? or not. And so that's sort of the problem that's continually confronted in a variety of regulatory contexts. So anyway, a lot of the evidence on behavioral anomalies comes from experiments. And the experiments often involve students, small stakes experiments. Could involve mugs, could involve candy bars, but seldom experiments where people's lives are at risk. But yet, the experimental results do have some counterparts in the real world where there's behavioral anomalies have been identified. So health club memberships, people join health clubs, they sign up for a year membership, they go for a week and then don't keep going. So the health club people sort of exploit that intertemporal irrationality. Cab driver effort, once they hit their goal, their target for the day, they quit. Once they make enough money, retirement savings may be irrational, credit card usage and so on. Consumers don't pay enough attention to shipping costs. I don't think these irrationality, I think they've been documented, but I don't think that they're so rampant that we should take away all of consumer choice, which is close to what's being proposed in many contexts. What we propose is that we should have a behavioral transfer test, and this is a counterpart. There are benefits transfer tests that are part of the standard guidance, both in the United States and the UK. So when you take a benefit number, whether it's the value of statistical life, let's say for the labor market, and apply it, let's say, to a transportation context, should be some rationale for doing so. Same sort of thing, you should be required to meet some sort of test when you take behavioral result, let's say from a student experiment, and say this is generalizable and we're going to regulate pensions based on students' intertemporal rates of time preference with respect to candy bars. And we're going to take this and say, well, based on these insights, we're now going to do this to the pension requirements. Well, as long as we're on candy bars, if you're estimating the demand elasticity in some economic analysis, regulatory impact analysis, we wouldn't use the demand elasticity for candy bars in a lab experiment and say that demand elasticity is the same as the demand elasticity for cigarettes, for cars, or all other consumer products. So just as we would demand some sort of basis for jumping from the lab experiment to the real world for the standard economic parameters in analysis, we should apply some sort of transferability test to the behavioral findings as well. So here are our behavioral transfer concepts. So the question you may want to ask is the experiment reflective of actual market decisions? So if you're coming in with some experimental results, does this mirror the thing that we're regulating? So is this a decision they're making frequently? So if consumers are making this decision every time they go to the store, that's a little bit different than students going in with a one-shot deal in an experimental context and being forced to make an unfamiliar decision. Are there opportunities for learning? In the real world, there's opportunities for learning. So you might want your experiment to incorporate opportunities for learning if that's important in the real world. Are the stakes? How does the level of the stakes affect the care that people devote to making the particular decision? And what are the characteristics of the decision makers? Are they smart? Do you have to be sharp? I mean, most of the decision makers in these experiments are undergraduate students who are paid a fee to participate in the experiment. And I think these experimental results, and we've done experiments too, we've documented intertemporal irrationalities, overestimations of risk, and so on. They suggest possible market failures, but they don't necessarily shed light on the particular magnitude of the market failure. So in general, we suggest a higher level of scrutiny should be provided than has been provided to date. So here are behavioral transfer guidelines. The first is the sample reflective of the beliefs and preferences of the group affected by the policy. Is the behavioral context parallel to the policy situation? Do respondents really understand what's being valued? And this is often a hard thing to do. You know, students walk into an experiment and it comes all pretty quickly. What's the metric that we're using? Is it dollars, like a willingness to pay number, or is it a happiness scale? And I'll return to happiness in a minute. Are the responses consistent? So do they give sensible responses? And did respondents attend to the survey task? Well, these sorts of things you see here, these are not new inventions. These are the same criteria that have been applied to stated preference studies before they can be used in regulatory impact analysis. So if we require these of stated preference studies, you want the same sort of consistency rationality test to be met by these experimental results that purportedly demonstrate anomalies in behavior. So here's an example in the average ratio in these experiments of the willingness to accept over willingness to pay is either 7.2 as the mean or 3.3 geometric mean. So it's a huge gap between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. And I have to confess, 2 of these studies in these surveys are mine. So that, you know, I've also shown in experimental context huge gaps between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. So we went out there and said, well, if this is true, what does this do to our value of statistical life estimates? So if the value of statistical life, if you're paid money to work in a risky job, if that's a willingness to accept number, does this mean we should divide everything by a factor of 7 or a factor of 3 to get the right number for willingness to pay? So what we did, we looked at workers who went from one job to a more dangerous job, that would be willingness to accept, and workers who went from a job to a less dangerous job, willingness to pay, and said, well, is there a difference between the willingness to accept and willingness to pay numbers? And as it turns out, there's not. There's no statistically significant difference. So at least in this context, with workers making repeated real stakes job decisions, there was no willingness to accept, willingness to pay gap. So at least in this situation, we're sort of confident that you can continue to use the regular VSL numbers, but also suggest that maybe in other situations as well, the real world may not necessarily perform as badly as the experimental results indicate. Discounting is another one, and often the time horizon in these experiments is short. And the question is, what should we do with these things? It's fairly easy to document hyperbolic discounting or intertemporal irrationalities where people overweight, the near term relative to the far term. But is that as big a problem with real decisions? I'm not sure. And if we are to use a rational reference point, what's the right rational reference point? U.S. government agencies have assumed that, well, since the government discount rate is 3%, everybody should be using a 3% discount rate in all their decisions, and anything they do that doesn't use a 3% discount rate is irrational. Well, that means that every credit card purchase that people make where they actually pay credit is irrational. So that really what you want to do is have a more nuanced assessment of intertemporal irrationality than assuming that everybody has access to risk-free government interest rates. And this 3%, this is not a fiction. This was used to justify the energy efficiency standards for appliances and cars. And the assumption is that the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Transportation assume that it's self-evident that because of psychological biases, people undervalue long-term gains. They provide no citations whatsoever for this assertion, but they just say it's claim. But actually, if you look at the literature, the evidence is fairly mixed. Not necessarily, people don't necessarily make irrational energy efficiency decisions. Michael Greenstone, Hunt Alcott, and others have done work on that. So that's cast doubt on the fact that if you look at the benefit assessments for these energy efficiency standards, well, how big a role does consumer irrationality play? 85 to 87% of the benefits are because these regulations are fixing consumer irrationality. So even though they're touted as, they're often called, greenhouse gas regulations or climate change initiatives. The lion's share of the benefits has nothing to do with that. The lion's share of the benefits is fixing alleged consumer irrationalities because consumers don't make the same decisions by buying the most fuel-efficient cars and don't act as if they have a 3% rate of time preference. The next thing, there's a quote that's out of the regulatory impact analysis where they also had the similar complaints about companies. Companies, when they buy fleets of trucks, also don't seem to be rational. According to the regulatory analysis, it's a conundrum from an economics perspective that large fuel economy savings have not been provided by automakers and purchased by consumers. And then one of the conundrums is why do these people who buy fleets of trucks, why aren't they smart about this? Well, it may be that they are. These are not consumers making decisions. These are profit-oriented companies that presumably will be driven out of business if they don't make efficient decisions. So this sort of thing, when you notice that companies and consumers both are making decisions inconsistent with what you think is rational behavior, you might want to delve more deeply into what the particular irrational behavior is. It's, as opposed to, in this case, it was taken as self-evident that people are making irrational choices. So there's no empirical evidence whatsoever provided in these regulatory impact analyses. So anyway, we advocate a fully informed, rational outcome should be the preferred basis. Let me jump down to the Happyville parable, which is, well, should we be cleaning up real risks or imaginary risks? So this comes up, let's say you have a hazardous waste site and people think it's really, really dangerous, but it's not. Should we clean that up? Well, cleaning that up reflects consumer sovereignty. And this is actually, and I've dealt with the officials, including economists at the Environmental Protection Agency, who said, yeah, we've got to respect consumer preferences. But I would suggest a better target would be to focus on actual risks rather than imaginary risks. And just like we don't respect consumer preferences, when they underestimate product risk, we don't say, oh, we're not going to regulate that product because you don't think it's dangerous. So we don't respect those risk beliefs. So by the same token, we should not necessarily respect the risk beliefs if people overestimate the risk. This is inspired not by yesterday's talk, but in general. People have suggested replacing benefit cost analysis with happiness scales. And I think happiness scales are useful for a lot of things. We heard a lot of those useful things yesterday. But I don't think it's going to replace benefit cost analysis. So let me jump down to the third bullet. The happiness scales, although you can ask questions such as, did you smile yesterday? Most of the happiness scales are not of that ilk. They ask people to rate your happiness or your satisfaction with your life on a scale of 0 to 10. Today I feel like it's a nice day outside. I feel like a 9. It's pretty good. Or 1 to 10 is another one. 1 to 7 or 0, 1, did you smile yesterday? The question is, how do you even think about these scales and how exactly are we going to run with these in a benefit cost analysis? So first of all, there's no reference point for the rating. So if you ask a paraplegic, how happy are you today? Well, is this conditional upon being a paraplegic and it's a sunny day? Well, conditional on being a paraplegic and a sunny day, then I think it's an 8 or a 9. But heck, I'd much rather not be completely healthy. So that, what's the reference point that people use in answering these questions? That's generally not defined. Second, these are ordinal scales with no quantitative significance. So if you go down from 7 to 5, I used to be a 7, but it's cloudy today, I dropped down to a 5. Is that the same loss in welfare as dropping from 4 to 2? So if we're going to use this to substitute for benefit cost analysis, we have to be able to assign some quantitative significance to this metric. These scales, there's no theoretical justification for any of these to deal with probabilistic impacts. First of all, they reject expected utility theory as being not appropriate. And so what do? So there's a 50% chance I'm in a world where my scale will be a 4, a 50% chance we're in a world where my scale will be a 2. what's my expected happiness? Am I allowed to multiply them the way I would with expected utility theory? There's no formal theoretical development for that exists in the literature. And there are also two courses for most policies. So, I used to be a 9. Let's say I'm a 9. And they've eliminated the risk of my job, which is 1 chance in 25,000 risk of death. So does that make me a 10? Is that enough to move me on the happiness scale? And if, and how do and when I look across all the different, when you do regulatory impact analysis, there's lots of different components of it. When I start assigning values to all the different components, how do I aggregate across all the different components, all the different happiness scores? So this is simply not well developed. I may be hitting overly hard on this, but people have actually suggested replacing benefit cost analysis with happiness scales, and I don't think that that's ready for prime time yet. So anyway, the happiness ratings, they fail rationality tests such as adverse health shocks. I'll skip these. Go to the implications. So, okay, so people are sometimes irrational. So less salient taxes, taxes that people don't really perceive, don't have the same effort distortions as taxes where people are aware of the taxes. So, for example, this is the paid tolls versus electronic tolls. If you're going down a toll road and you actually pay, you're conscious of making the payment, whereas electronic tolls, you're less conscious. So should the government exploit the fact that people are not aware of a certain less salient cost when they design their policies? Doing that may cause less of an effort distortion, but we oppose, sort of like tricking people by not pursuing policies that they understand. So we actually favor full information, rational decision-making, and informed citizenry, as opposed to trying to sneak something by them by exploiting behavioral irrationalities. So conclusion. The fact that there are behavioral failures, yes, there are behavioral failures, and they actually can be potentially important in a lot of contexts, but they don't provide open-ended justification for assuming complete irrationality. Second, the behavioral criteria, the same sort of criteria we apply for anything else that goes into a regulatory impact analysis or economic analysis, we should apply the same types of criteria to the behavioral findings as well, to ensure that applying them actually is a meaningful way to assess the merits of the particular regulation. So we propose a behavioral transfer test, the analog of a benefit transfer test, that there should be a behavioral transfer test. We still like fully informed rational decision makers as the reference point for policy analysis, as opposed to respecting the decisions of irrational consumers. It's also a well-defined reference point. Okay, so you don't like expected utility model. Which alternative do you want to adopt? I mean, prospect theory is not the only one. There's cumulative prospect theory, rank-dependent expected utility theory. We get a new theory of irrational choice under uncertainty almost every issue of the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty. So you're going to have to pick one as the alternative. If you don't like rational choice, tell me which it is, and we'll run with it. But right now, rational choice seems to be the one to beat. So our default is to respect consumer sovereignty, not to override it with regulations. That's it.
Hopefully that's a nice segue over to Sue. I believe you're going to touch on some issues related to, do we need independent reviews of regulations? So hopefully they'll address some sort of behavioural irrationalities among regulators, and to get to the underlying rationale for regulation. So over to Sue. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And look, I'll give you some perspectives from a number of areas that I come from, but really I'm going to look at two questions. One is, do we need to be clearer on the rationale for regulation? And two is, do we actually need some sort of gateway or gatekeeping? And that's where I really will draw on some of my experience and how I've somewhat changed, and that's reflected in the review that we're currently looking at now. In relation to do we need to be clearer on the rationale for regulation? Absolutely. I mean, it's the core grievance that you hear from the regulator that the actual problem has not been identified. So too often we jump to the solution without actually saying, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And even if we do come up with what is the problem, then what we don't do well is then say, well, what are the options for actually resolving that problem? We jump straight to regulation. And government has always been very good at selling the benefits of regulation, but less so good really when it comes to identifying the costs. And cost-benefit analysis does provide you with the process for the thinking around identifying what are the costs. But we do continue to explore and test other mechanisms and tools, and certainly some of what Martin's been talking about in being able to draw on digital design and data is going to be able to help us in the future. But for me, you know, the key is really good consultation. You've heard, you know, Kip even talk about what it means from the user experience, and that's certainly where we've come from on the review is what is the experience of the regulated and how do we, you know, input that into our thinking around good regulatory design. And for all that government can have the best processes to follow, in the end, they can't actually stand in the shoes of the regulated unless they are actually talking to the regulated and they know what does it mean. Because most of the compliance burden comes in the implementation. You can have beautifully designed regulation and then you go to implement it and that's how it's implemented and that's where you get the red tape and that's where you get the angst. So along with what we're saying in our review about good, key, early, open consultation, we're also saying, well, how can we actually get some sort of knowledge from the regulated into the regulators? And so we're also recommending secondees. So you can actually get some sort of transfer of knowledge across. You know, now there's been, I guess, some suggestion that there could be regulatory capture. But I think really what we want to do is try and say, how do you somehow bring in the experience of the regulated when you're actually designing regulation? So that's, you know, certainly a couple of the areas we're looking at. But also as part of the review, we're actually recommending a focus on the end user and outcomes, a focused approach. So really start with what are you trying to achieve and why is government intervention required? Now, you know, the use of co-design and the greater use of digital design and data will actually help here, and certainly being able to involve what we call regulatory sandboxes, so trials, and being able to test different ways of putting in place regulation are things that are going to go a long way towards this. But, you know, I've been working in this a long time, and I know that a lot of the time the solution is given to people in government doesn't come from you. It comes from our elected representatives. And the political process is what does impact this, because good policy design starts with a bottom-up approach. It does start, you know, with good consultation. It does start with thinking about what is the problem. But what we have quite often is you get given the solution and you get told to retrofit. That becomes our problem with our RIS process, because you end up coming up with a RIS that ends up retrofitting to the solution. Some examples in New South Wales would be greyhound ban, lockout laws, things like that. It is really difficult. One of the things we're actually saying is that, you know, as part of our report as well, is that our elected representatives actually need to be trained and skilled in the process that sit around this and what are the implications. And we're not going to shy away from using some of these examples, because the consequences of not thinking about implementation of regulation before you actually go out and announce something can have, as we've seen, serious consequences, and in the end your political career may not continue. One of the examples that we used, and this goes back quite a number of years ago, so it was when we were working on the Banks Task Force on red tape. It was before the Office of Best Practice Regulation was created, and it was we were developing something called the business cost calculator that, you know, was criticised for it being too simplistic. But one of the things we said was, well, you've got to have something. Agencies need to have something to help them think about what is the impact on the user. And at the moment, they don't have anything. And the way we actually got it up, and we actually got cabinet support, it was we thought about what's the regulation that is going to really touch at the heartstrings of politicians. And at the time, there was a whole lot of talk around banning the use of ammonium nitrate. And the reason that was there was because it had been used in the Oklahoma bombings. It was also a major component of fertiliser used in the agricultural sector. So we thought this would be a really good one to use. It was interesting trying to research this when you were in a government department because you kept getting a red screen that said you were actually accessing websites that you weren't supposed to. But using an example like that really made a difference, particularly given we had a lot of rural and regional elected members in the cabinet at the time, meant that they actually not only mandated the use of the business cost calculator for all Commonwealth regulation, but they actually approved its use for COAG regulation as well. So really, that's what was the genesis of the new reform around better regulation and best practice regulation that led to the creation of the Office of Best Practice Regulation. What we don't have, though, and it's always very difficult, and that is to recognise the diversity that we have with users. So we tend to have a regulation and we say that it's going to be implemented across the board. Sometimes we do get some carve-outs. For example, if we're looking at, in the taxation area, small business regulation versus what may apply to bigger business. One of the things that we've always found very difficult to do is really look at how we can look at the diversity in our metropolitan areas versus our regional. So a couple of examples there is when you think about some of the regulations that apply in the environmental area. I was recently talking to someone about wood-burning fires. Now, in metropolitan areas, it is a real issue because of the smoke. If you're out on a farm, having a wood fire where you've got access to wood is probably not an issue. Water regulation is similar. Regulation around employment, visas, temporary workers. Think about backpackers in regional areas where that's what they depend on so much. So we've really got to think carefully when we're introducing regulations, not just on the size of the business, but on the diversity and where it's going to apply and regional differences. And I'll come back to that when I start to look at jurisdictional issues. Now let me touch on gateways and gatekeeping. Now this is an interesting question because, you know, it's almost as if I'd have to say, well, the answer is it depends. Because it does depend at what time you're in the cultural cycle of government. And that can change across different departments and agencies. But you really need to have a culture and a mindset to thinking about outcomes and the impact on the regulated and why am I doing this in the first place, as opposed to we must regulate because it's the only way we're actually going to get behavioural change. And so it ends up being cyclical. At the time that the Office of Best Practice Regulation was set up, it was a time when there had been a real tick and flick approach to RISs. They weren't taken seriously. The previous was seen as being the policeman, and the RISs were done at the last minute, and there used to be real angst between the department and the minister as to why they should be done at all. So when we came in with the OBPR, we really looked at it being best practice. And I always used to say, we're on the same side here. We all want the best outcome for both the regulated and the regulators. So how do we work together, and how do we actually get a process that works for all of us so we can start early? This is a process that is meant to help you with good policy development. This is not meant to be a checklist that you do at the end and then becomes a problem for you. So we looked at that as being a way that we could actually work through it. And I would have to say, having been in a position where I had the power to stop regulations going to Cabinet, because I could actually say this does not meet best practice requirements, I'm now saying, look, we've actually got to have a different approach, because in the end, why should I be the decision maker? I'm not the elected person. We elect people to actually make that decision. Now, given what Kip said about students being used in a decision-making process, I wouldn't think they're any worse off than the decision makers we have now. What you need, though, is you need to actually make sure you have a strong agency, strong bureaucrats behind it that provide and do all the thinking so that what's provided to those that make the decisions is enough information to allow them to make a good informed decision. And so in taking that thinking further, and this is what we've put through into our review, because we've really thought about this carefully, and we said we shouldn't be in a position where we take away that power from the decision maker. So that's where we've said that we believe stewardship is really important, because stewardship actually puts that responsibility on the department or agency itself, and in particular the agency head, to say, well, you're the ones that in the end need to take ownership of the decision and the regulation that is made. So you need to make sure that you have people that can follow the right processes, you have people that are skilled, you are employing the right consultative mechanisms, you are doing everything that you can to actually provide the best information to your minister or whoever may be the decision maker to allow them to make that decision. And that's one of our, I would say one of our really strong recommendations as part of our review, because this stewardship approach is something that puts the responsibility back on the department or agency. We do believe it needs to be tied to performance. But in the end, there's also peer review that will actually help us, we hope, get a better outcome than what we've got now, because certainly when we look at what's happening at the New South Wales level, it's not much difference to what I saw, many years ago when the OBPR was set up, and that was whizzes have become tick and flick. There's not a commitment to the process, there's not a commitment to the outcome, and the process has overtaken what we're trying to do, and there's a lot of angst around having to do this, and it becomes a compliance burden for government itself. In the end, as I said, no matter if you're the regulator or the elected person, we're all on the same side, including the gatekeeper. And so we're trying to get the best outcome for the community. And that's why we think stewardship holds a lot of promise in that area. But this, of course, raises another question, and that is, who is the community? So at the federal level, you'd say, well, it's all Australians. But what about at the state level? Is it New South Wales constituency? And if you do impose regulations at the New South Wales level, do you say, well, at any expense to Queenslanders and Victorians? And in actual fact, that is an ongoing dilemma for us, because cross-jurisdictional issues end up being among the highest in the types of complaints that business will raise when it comes to red tape. Because we once again haven't quite got that right in terms of when we're assessing, do we assess solely at the state level, or do we actually then consider other impacts? Now, my view is you should consider other impacts. In the end, it's up to the decision maker to make that decision. But, when I was at the OPPR, one of the really good RISs, believe it or not, I assessed was plastic bags. It was a COAG RIS. A lot of the CBA was done through the Productivity Commission that had come up with a separate report on plastic bags. The then Minister at the time, Peter Garrett, said benefits don't outweigh costs. There would not be a ban on plastic bags. Of course, it was a COAG decision, so South Australia went out straight away and banned plastic bags. ACT followed soon. New South Wales, and I live in New South Wales, held firm until last week when Woolies and Coles both came out and said that they were going to ban plastic bags. And New South Wales now looks like it's going along that route. What was the problem we're trying to solve? Or are we actually trying to make a constituency happy? Now, in the end, it's up to the decision maker to do that. One of the other things we're saying as part of our review is transparency should actually sit around that. We should not crucify our decision makers if they make that decision. They just need to justify why they made it. And so when we look at where you have post-implementation reviews, it's not about reopening that whole question. It's about saying, do we need to tweak this? What do we need to do now? And looking at the implementation side. But, you know, that was an interesting lesson on, as I said, you know, one of the better RISs I saw and the better CBAs that still didn't make any difference. So in conclusion, this isn't easy or quick. Our environment keeps changing. There's challenges all the time. I think the really important thing is that our regulatory frameworks are flexible so that we can change and respond to things that occur, that it's outcomes focused, that it's transparent, but importantly, regulation is not set and forget. So we can't ever think that we put something in place and we never continue to ask the question, is it fit for purpose? Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. We'll move straight on to Peter, who I suspect will provide perspectives on building on a lot of what's been said already. There we go.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, this is meant to be a short presentation. When Richard asked me to do it, I thought, well, really, I'm not sure that I have anything particularly to say that's new on the subject. This is sort of really 101 economics, but hopefully as 101 economics it's still useful. So why regulate? Why regulate? Objectives of regulation. That's been discussed a bit, but I'm going to actually broaden that a little bit. Some examples of regulation and their objectives using CBA, arguments against, and conclusions. So why regulate? I mean, Vic focused very much on protecting consumers. That's certainly a major reason, but of course the broad thing is market failure and social equity. Economists tend to regard social equity as a separate issue from market failure, so they are sometimes confused. But it's not just market failure. We have, to set up the whole system, we need generic laws, property laws, prudential regulation, which are fundamental to running the economy. Then we, of course, have monopoly, classic market failure. I'm not going to discuss the ACCC in this presentation. And then there are the key micro drivers, and they are largely about protection in one form or another, poor information, which has been discussed, leading to poor individual or corporate decisions. Negative externalities, the third-party effect, which hasn't really had a lot of discussion here. And the other one is unequal powers. We do regulate, actually, for social equity reasons, our unequal powers as well. So here are some examples of regulations. I mean, our life is full of regulations. I could write 10 tables like this, but these are just some examples. So prudential regulation, very important. Why do we do that? Well, that's because of systemic protection of the whole system. Penalty rates. Why do we have penalty rates? Well, because we perceive there to be unequal powers between employers and employees. That may or may not be justified, but that still is why we regulate. Occupational health and workplace standards. Well, it's partly poor information, but it's also partly to do with unequal powers, that employers again perceive to have more powers than workers, and we need to protect the workers' powers as well as having poor information. Female representation on company boards. Well, it could be poor information that all the males who run the place underestimate females. It could be a power situation. Again, there are social equity reasons why we do regulate or think of regulating in some of those areas. Product standards, the ones I put asterisks on I've actually worked on. Food standards, food safety standards. Why do we regulate food safety standards? We do regulate, there's a big regulator in foods, Australia, New Zealand food standards out of Canberra. Well, because actually we don't really have a lot of information about how horticulture is provided, how livestock's looked after, how the chickens and the eggs are produced and so forth. As a consumer, I don't have that. I mean, I suppose that if I got sick sufficiently often, I would learn, but I'd rather not get sick first. So there we have poor information and possibly poor outcomes without regulation. Tobacco product messaging. I did a large report on the first one about why we should have special packaging on tobacco packaging, well, again, the argument will be poor information, that people aren't very well informed. It doesn't stop people smoking, but it's meant to help their information, and poor outcomes if they don't learn. And there is some evidence that people do smoke less because they see these things on tobacco packs. Trade and professional standards. Well, we regulate professional standards here to help make sure that you're seeing a genuine doctor and not a false doctor. On the whole, I think that's quite a good idea. The swimming pool safety barriers, well, poor information, maybe the poor information now relates to, do we actually really know the safety risks adequately? But there's certainly third-party effects there. We're protecting people who wander into the property or other people's children who come in. Driving regulations, well, third-party effects, obviously, safety, there's a big issue. Possibly we might also protect our own safety better. Environmental protections, third-party. Lockout regulations, third-party effects. Planning regulations, all third-party effects. Minimum housing standards. I did some work for the Victorian government recently. They wanted to introduce minimum housing standards into city, and it's actually not clear really. I call that resident protection. I'm not really quite sure what the objectives were. It certainly didn't meet the cost benefit that I provided for them. Short-term letting. Well, that's to third-party effects. A lot of people living in units hate the idea of short-term letting, so it's third-party effects. Mind you, I don't think you can actually have regulations on that. I think it's completely ineffective, but as far as you've got a rationale. And then regulation of dogs. Well, that's a favourite one of mine. We're always regulating dogs, and there's third-party effects because basically there's about 5% of the population who actually hate dogs and are paranoid about them, so we have to regulate dogs, apparently. So there's a whole lot of reason why we have regulations. And as I said, it certainly is poor information, but it's also third-party effects. It's also unequal powers, and they're all reasons. Now, cost-benefit analysis is clearly the standard method of evaluation. You view the costs, you view the benefits, you try to maximize social welfare. As the point has been made, you really do need to specify why you're doing it, because after all, one option is always not regulating, so you do need to do that. And the other thing is, of course, you do need to look at all the options. The lockout laws, for example, the cost-benefit study that was done there really didn't look at any options. It was, do you have no regulation or do you have the lockout laws? They didn't really look at, therefore they didn't look at the options. And that obviously is fundamental to doing cost-benefit analysis. References, Office of Best Practice Regulation, cost-benefit analysis is fully committed to use of CBA to evaluate regulations. The New South Wales Treasury, representatives here, our guide to cost-benefit analysis, totally committed to cost-benefit analysis for regulatory proposals. The recent regulatory framework, which has come out, been talked about today, it's generally supportive of CBA. I would have liked to see rather stronger statements in favour of cost-benefit analysis than you've come out with so far. So selective examples, well, this is just a reference for anybody who wants to see some recent studies. The one applied economics that I did for the Department of Health on the proposed new healthcare warnings. Aisle Allen has done a recent study on Building Professionals Act. The CIE has done an update, actually, on regulation of private swimming pool pole barriers. That should be pool, actually, not pole barriers. I did a study of that about 10 years ago. CIE have updated, well, not updated it, done some more work. And then there's this was the lockout laws, which was done by New South Wales Treasury, which is okay as far as it goes, but it doesn't really go far enough. It doesn't look properly at options. So very quickly, 4 issues with CBA, responses and conclusions. Well, clearly, one issue is whether it's too onerous. A general question of significance of regulation. Lots of regulations are very minor. I mean, we wouldn't want to do a full cost-benefit analysis on whether dogs are allowed on a particular park between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, which is the kind of thing you do within local councils. It's clearly got to be proportionate and scalable. But having said that, the major costs and benefits can usually be stated quite simply. It's a complete myth to think cost-benefit analysis has got to be onerous. It can actually be really done often in 48 hours. What's the cost, what are the benefits? At least gives you a framework. you can, or a couple of weeks. The idea that it's very onerous, but it really needs to be scalable. The idea that cost benefit is not possible, well, the key issue there is always with forecasting behaviour. What's going to be the outcome of regulation? If you put notices on tobacco packs, will it really stop people smoking? If you put barriers around swimming pools, will fewer babies drown, or is it really because the adults supervising them actually leave the gates open? The valuation principles or practices are really quite robust in cost-benefit analysis. The problem is always actually with the forecasting, the behavioural changes and those impacts. It does make things properly. The third point is that cost-benefit analysis may well be inappropriate when dealing with social equity issues. For example, occupational health and safety. It may be that the benefits to the workers are less than the cost to the employer, but you may still say that for social equity we want to protect the workers. Selling dangerous products, deceiving consumers. Basically, we don't want to see dangerous products and consumers deceived. So, or causing pollution, if you're causing pollution. So, when you're dealing with social equity, can you use cost-benefit? Well, you can still use cost-benefit to at least frame the costs and benefits, but you may decide that actually you're not going to require a benefit-cost ratio greater than 1 because you put much more emphasis on the people who are being protected than the people who are causing the damage. Are there any better methods such as multi-criteria analysis? Don't start me on multi-criteria analysis, I hate it. So the conclusions are then, cost-benefit analysis is core evaluation process for any substantive social issue. Many regulations are very minor, still consider the costs and benefits. Of course, focus on the reason for regulations, and I gave the major reasons for a lot of their cases and the options. The major problems are actually, in my experience, forecasting behaviour, whether people and outcomes. If you have lockout laws, will it actually change people's behaviour? Will you just move aggression from one part of the city to another? Will you actually stop smoking if you advise people that they might get cancer? But there are general problems, not CBA problems. They're going to arise whatever your method of evaluation is. You don't escape them by moving out of cost-benefit analysis. But when there are sufficient equity objectives, cost-benefit analysis, I think, is a useful framework for evaluating outcomes, but decision makers may certainly weight outcomes in a different way to protect particular groups in the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So we've had 4 different speakers with a broad range of perspectives. Open up the floor to questions. If the people have got immediately got a question there, if you want to fire away. Oh, mic coming? Yep.
Felix Carmel from the Central Services Commission of South Australia, the economic regulator in the room. So you did mention about effective consultation. One of the issues that I've been asked to solve in our place is basically incorporating a customer voice into a CBA. I was wondering if anyone up there has actually tried to do this, or what's an effective way of doing it?
Look, we might come back to if anyone else is aware of this, and certainly from the panel or even elsewhere. I'm not aware of that specific example being used here, but there are 2 countries that, when you look at consultation, have done it really well and openly, and that's the UK and New Zealand. They just take it for granted that you will consult, that they don't regard the confidentiality issue, even with taxation, as being something that you shouldn't actually engage early. They have consultation RISs, and they get the input through that process. I think here it's going to be a step too far to go to those models, but certainly having that earlier consultation, even if you have select consultation where you can incorporate that consumer voice by having a group of people that you can test things with, because at least that then gives a better ability not only to be able to recognise the impact on the regulated, but what it does end up happening down the line is that you are less likely to need to have to amend regulation due to what people call unintended consequences, and so we're trying to mitigate against those unintended or unforeseen consequences. But certainly if anyone's aware of
Can I just make one quick comment? It seems to me the difficulty is if we assume that the game only starts when we need to talk to them because there's a CBA on, then you've got a problem to start with, because the stewardship concept strikes me, and I'm going back to NZ to some extent, and obviously we've done a lot of thinking about this, suggests that rather than seeing the consultation piece as the end point, although every now and then you do have to do something very specific, you have to think more about the conversation you are having almost all the time with regulated and other stakeholders, so that the notion that somehow all of a sudden we're going to start talking to them becomes less of a problem. And it may well be that some of that conversational engagement as a function of simply, doing regulation well all the time actually provides you with a lot of input and a lot of insight that you can then use. So I think sometimes we make it harder for ourselves than we need to.
Thanks. Brad Ruding from the Productivity Commission. So you mentioned trials and regulatory sandboxes, and perhaps trials do have a lot of promise in dealing with issues like quantifying outcomes or using behavioural transfer and these sort of issues. Are there barriers to regulators actually using trials at the moment, given that trials are often associated with error? And how can these barriers be addressed?
And look, I know that Martin will want to jump in here as well. I'll give you a really good, very recent example of trials, and that's the NDIS in relation to opening up the area of human services. And certainly, this came from Harper, and we recommended that human services should be open. Of course, it had always been, government that tended to provide these services. But the NDIS was really a way of being able to trial it. Now, there were real challenges there, and I think it comes back to the fact that when you're looking at the area of human services, one size doesn't fit all, and you've got to be able to recognise that. You can't just have a template approach. It's got to be very much an outcomes approach, and of course, because I think that was not necessarily recognised early, you then had that separate debate about how much this was going to cost, and the cost was going to be, were going to be a lot higher. I still would say the costs of doing that are going to be less in the long term than what we're currently doing. But I think that does give us a lot of really good examples about how you can put in place trials. So I think the barriers are the ones we put on ourselves when we say you can't do this because either it's too hard or it won't work, or, it's rather than say, let's have a go at it and let's acknowledge that we're not going to get everything right. That's the whole purpose of a trial. But then, let's not punish ourselves and beat ourselves up when we discover that we didn't quite do things right, and let's tweak that, and then let's do a second phase. But all of that informs how we would then put in place something on a more permanent basis.
Yeah, can I just stand up because I don't like talking through a lectern? It seems a bit weird. The point, I just picked that last point up. The whole point about doing a trial is because it's full of error. That's why you do it. Now, that's a very glib line to say at a conference. It's quite a difficult line to sell to a minister. So, Minister, we're going to do something which we will guarantee you will go wrong. Shall we do that? Now, I used to work for a minister about 400 years ago. Generally speaking, that's not a very easy conversation to prosecute. But it's actually, if you go back to the wonderful world of design, the reason designers do trials, they call them prototypes. Much nicer word, right? Much cooler word. The reason they do prototypes is because they want to find out as quickly as possible what can possibly go wrong with this thing so that the next one will be a hell of a lot better. So it does strike me that we have to get ourselves into a policy and regulatory framework that says we like the idea of quickly finding out what's wrong with this idea. We do have a minister in this state, including the one who commissioned this report, who at least rhetorically, and I think to be fair to him, in reality is actually quite a big proponent of the idea of trials and prototypes. But you're right. It's kind of because they're full of error that you would exactly want to do them, and do them as early as possible when the errors have as little cost as possible. Obvious point, but a fairly important one.
I'd personally like to throw in a question here. While I'm waiting, with the increasing in technology and getting to this point of, how do we cope with the issue that technology might make certain regulation redundant? And can anybody sort of provide, things even like sort of safety type of regulation? If we can monitor things better, can we then effectively get it back to change the type of regulation so it becomes more of a market-based approach or a consumer-based approach? how do we control for that? We've got these redundant regulations. Kip, you think you're going to... Or you look like you're going to respond, or... Yeah.
No, I was thinking about it. I mean, that's an interesting question, because we've had changes in technology forever. I mean, it's not, not just now with, self-driving cars, but generally the government, as technology becomes available, they tend to mandate the technological devices as opposed to turning the market loose. So at least to date, it's led to more regulatory requirements rather than fewer.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if, your vision is that we're going to have a regulation-free future because everything will be technologically set. I mean, I think there's going to be standards for the computer operating systems of all these vehicles, and I think there's going to be a lot of regulation coming. And at this point, like with the automatic acceleration of the Toyotas, the unintended acceleration of Toyotas, which may or may not have happened. But anyway, the government regulators really had no way of figuring out whether there really was a problem because it was so technologically sophisticated, it was beyond their skill level. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of situations where they've got to grapple with things they don't really understand. And I think they're in for some tough sledding ahead.
Yeah.
Just in terms of there's a big technological gap between, or a growing technological gap between the technologies companies are implementing and what the government's capable of regulating. And I'm not sure how they're going to overcome that.
Please do raise hands, otherwise I'll continue on this line. Yes? Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Peter Williams, Australian Bureau of Statistics. Just to follow up on that, I guess I've got a question about the use of different data sets, especially by government agencies, to help with reducing regulation burden. I guess working in a government agency, I've found that although conceptually sounds great, I guess practically it's quite resource intensive and actually takes a long time for that to actually work. I guess my question is, for New South Wales, do you think there's enough political appetite, I guess, for the short-term expenses and resources that would require for that to actually work in practice?
Yeah. I think in New South Wales the political appetite's very high. I think the bureaucratic appetite's a little lower. So if you speak to Victor Dominello and a couple of his colleagues around the cabinet table, they will say, bring it on, do it faster, and how come you're so slow? And that's why he set up the Data Analytics Centre, and he gave Ian Opperman the job and a piece of legislation to say, not only do we want to encourage agencies to start doing the work and putting the effort in, and you're right, in the beginning of the front end it's going to require a bit of time and effort, but he gave Ian legislation to make sure that these agencies have to do it, even if they don't want to. So I would say that at the moment, and I have worked in New South Wales, including in the Cabinet Office years and years ago, I'd say that the appetite was as high as I've ever seen it, to be honest. And the DAC, as we love to call it, the DAC, is essentially the vehicle that's trying to accelerate some of that process.
Could you give an example of when technology actually reduces the need for regulation? I mean, take speeding, for example. Technology means you don't need policemen on the roads, you can have drones or whatever, but it doesn't change the regulation, does it, that you mustn't go over the 70k an hour in this spot? When does technology actually get rid of the regulation?
I can respond to that, but
Go right ahead.
I'll come back. Can we come in here?
Yeah.
Philip Norman, I'm a member of the Melbourne Cricket Club. Okay, for the last 150 years we've had rules in the club, shouldn't be nasty to fellow members. But in the last few years you can text, there's a thing on the scoreboard, if you hear someone racist remarks, you text the number, right? And then there's a 40-year waiting list and you get banned for life. It's a really big thing, but I'd imagine...
The regulation hasn't changed, though.
The regulation hasn't changed, but I'd imagine that the behaviour is changing, and within another decade or so, you won't need to have that regulation to be banned for life because the members will actually deal with it in a fairly frank and physical way on the spot.
Perhaps got another example down there?
Yes,
sorry.
Michael Potter from the Centre for Independent Studies. I think a really great example of technology removing a need for regulation is taxis.
are always irrelevant.
That's a slightly, but your question's slightly different. He's answering your question directly, so I think it's a very good answer.
No, I part-made, I mean, there's stupid regulations on the taxi industry for years and years, which never should have been there.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. So in a sense, the regulations were a significant barrier, and there was a lack of political will to reform it, and the market and technology and disruption has actually dealt with the problem of the regulation.
Sorry, to the microphone.
Paul Hislop here from ACEL Allen. Actually, my question's kind of very much related to that discussion, and it goes to Peter, you in particular were raising, I think, a lot of the reason for regulation being around the lack of information, and technology is providing a lot more information, and in fact the example of Lyft and Uber was a very good example. On the other hand, we're seeing governments more and more judge themselves by how much regulations they pass. And I mean, I remember a recent federal government that heralded the fact they passed 800 pieces of legislation within a government framework. They said 800 different ways that they get to control our lives. On the other hand, with the Twitter world, we're seeing the way that information is being used maybe in a fairly negative way, and not in a positive way to maybe provide real information, but maybe fake information. So I'm interested on your perspective, maybe Kip and you, on your perspectives on whether or not the access to information is going to actually reduce the need for regulation over time.
Well, the insurance companies, at least in the United States, we have State Farm insurance, you get a discount if you hook up a device to your car, which essentially lets them monitor how you're driving. So it's going to not get rid of the regulation, but if my insurance company knows that I like to drive, 50% higher than the posted speed limit, and they're going to raise my rates, then that could be a form of, financial sanction. And question, if they have the data, will the government be able to ever access, why not the government having access to the data and monitoring, all of the operations of my vehicle? So I don't see it being less regulation, but I see there could be there hasn't been as much of an informational revolution with regulations in other aspects of our life, and I think that may be coming.
Well, it's clearly logical that insofar as the regulation has used the lack of consumer information as the market imperfection, and the digital world will apparently give consumers better information, that you would need less need for regulation if that were the case. But of course, as you pointed out, the information flows can still be quite deceiving, so you may still decide you do need to have some protection of consumers.
Over here, please. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you all for the time. Mark Chin from Australian Treasury. Some might say that a red tape reduction target is not necessarily the best incentive to encourage meaningful outcomes for the regulated population. I would note that the Commonwealth currently has one in place. I was interested to hear your thoughts on that idea, and also whether you believe that another incentive might exist that is as politically powerful.
That's a really good question because Mark and
Paragraph one, I think, isn't it?
yes. So I think we start off our report saying that they're blunt instruments and they work in terms of picking the low-hanging fruit, but after you've done that, they're ineffective. And when you look at it, they're brought in. They tend to go with, when a government is elected and they're able to have it announceable, and that's going to be the new way of thinking, particularly if it's a change of government and the previous didn't have those sort of targets. They are blunt instruments. Targets can be good to focus your mind on, getting to achieving something in a space of time. But if you don't have other mechanisms, they're not sustainable, and so you actually need to have some longer term. You need behavioural change. That's what you need. I mean, people used to say to me, what would be a measure of success for the OBPR? And I used to say, well, in 5 years we didn't exist. Because what we wanted to do was actually embed our thinking at the agency level. So agencies were committed to best practice regulation, and it became part of their processes. You didn't ever need a gatekeeper. That didn't happen but as I said, you get swings and roundabouts with it. And what we're trying to do is say, how do you get a sustainable, flexible framework that you can put in place that can respond to changes in the environment and different things that we can't even foresee at the moment, that doesn't just get those spikes in response, but then you get, those low points where you actually don't achieve, and it's not outcomes focused.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is there are actually very few alternatives if you want a quick, cheap, simple, flashy sign that you're doing something about regulation. So there aren't very many others that you can say, well, we're going to do a 2 for 1 or 1 for 2 or whatever the game is. The only other issue it seems to me that might be powerful is to start saying to regulators and regulated, if you guys can get together and find a cheaper way of doing this, you can, as it were, keep the money and you can do something much more interesting with it. That might be kind of interesting. My experience with treasuries is that that's a conversation they're not terribly comfortable with. But for the people doing the actual change, it's quite a powerful mechanism to say, wow, if we could find a much better way of doing this, we could free up some resources to do 100 other much more useful things. But you're right. One of the reasons it seems to persist in my mind is because it's a very easy thing to write in a manifesto when you're quickly writing one.
It sounds good too.
Yes, exactly. Of course it does. Well, we're going to get rid of 2 regulations for every one we put out.
I'll give you a good example where we've got rid of lots of signs of regulations. In my municipality, we've taken down 20% of the regulatory signs in the last 4 years, on the basis of visual amenity. They were just so ugly and so unnecessary, most of them, and that's been extremely popular.
Right. Yeah, good stuff. I think we've got time for one more question until lunch, but obviously we'll continue these conversations over lunch. So over to perhaps the final question.
Rebecca McCallum, also from Treasury. I guess had a question about the interaction between the policy and the politics, because certainly from a policy-making perspective, and I think as you pointed out, so it doesn't matter how good your cost-benefit analysis is, that is often not what's driving the decision. And your comment about making the importance of making the analyses more transparent. And I was just wondering, I guess, on balance, is that transparency likely to make it more or less easy for policymakers to do their job? So, the difficulty can be that if it is going to be made public, there's a lot of pressure in terms of that stewardship about making sure that the CBA gives the kind of right political response, not necessarily on making it, clear to the public what's going on.
Look, I think that's where the plastic bags example actually provides, a good illustration of how each of those states went out and gave a reason for why they chose to completely go against what the Commonwealth had said would be the decision and what the reason the CBA showed. And I think that's where it's important about transparency. And it's also important to separate the advice from departments and agencies and the decision that the minister or the cabinet makes. We've actually New Zealand actually has a really good way of doing this because they completely separate that. They say the responsibility of the department is to provide the best advice they can. It's up to the cabinet to make the decision. And so they don't attach it to a minister because they say it's a cabinet decision. They actually have it's like the head of cabinet who actually with the leading minister, if they feel that where they're heading with this is going to be at odds with the departmental advice, they then can make the decision to pull it. But what they don't do is say, go back and retrofit. Now, it does come back to the agency getting a feel because, agency heads will generally have a conversation with their minister and their minister will be saying, I don't like what you're telling me, this is what I want to do. So you're never going to get away from that element of, but you've still got with a stewardship approach the fact that they need to have ownership and have a robust analysis, and they do have peer review and they do have performance standards as part of that, and have they met their performance standards?
I think at that we'll close this session. Can everyone join me in thanking the panellists?